Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you were able to find something for lunch in the short period of time. We have had a lot of very good questions posed, and we had one participant from South Africa that had to sign off to take care of other responsibilities. So I'm really happy that we have reached so many of you. This next presentation is on the both, I guess, lessons learned and and hopefully sending some messages for how we should operate in the future with some of the current developments, where we have a discussion with Cassie Boggs and Mel Sanderson. So remember too that if you have questions, please submit them to the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, and we have time at the end of this presentation to address them. And there's also time at the end of the summit today to talk about some of the questions that we may not have been able to address. So let's go to the next presentation. All right, our fourth topic here, we're going to look at a couple current developments, and the people that we're going to be talking to include, first of all, Melissa Sanderson, and I think that everyone calls her Mel. I'm not sure if she would even answer to Melissa. She was
only if I'm in trouble.
Oh, okay. That's what your mother called you, huh?
Absolutely.
Mel has had a significant service with the U.S. Foreign Service, and she's been posted to Moscow, Turkey, El Salvador, Peru, Congo for 8 years, and so most of her that's probably the bulk of your experience, hasn't it been, Mel, in the Congo?
Well, the 8 years is the combined total from the Foreign Service plus with Freeport.
Oh, okay, and Poland, and then she went from there to Freeport Minerals, where she is the retired director for international affairs, and is currently a director for Western Rare Earths. Our second participant here is Catherine Boggs, and she is also only known as Cassie. I don't know that her mother probably calls her Catherine. She started her career at Baker McKenzie and has service in Indonesia and Kazakhstan, and then as a senior vice president for Barrick Gold, where she worked in, among other places, Pakistan and Tanzania. And most recently, she's retired from Resource Capital Funds, where she was a partner and general counsel. And what we're going to be talking about is current developments on CSR. And I think that, quite frankly, just using the acronym of CSR probably diminishes the import of what we're talking about, because people will hear about CSR and they think that this is probably some new medical prescription that probably related to some sort of marijuana repackaging. But what we want to do is to look at some of the failures and successes of corporate social responsibility. And some of the things we'll be looking at is the Vale tailings dam failures in Brazil, both successes and failures of Freeport in Indonesia, then in Southern Copper. We'll look at Armenia, Tanzania with the North Moro mine, Papua New Guinea, in the Dominican Republic, at Pueblo Viejo, and in Australia, probably the most recent archaeological disruption. So welcome both Cassie and Mel. And shall we start out with Vale? And I think that, feel free to interrupt each other, and we don't have to go down the list and as how we have listed, but feel free to jump in and interrupt each other as appropriate.
Well,
So
maybe I'll start, and then that gives Cassie the chance to be the one who interrupts first. So I think that probably everybody who's participating in this conference knows what we're referring to when we say the tailings dam failure that affected Valle and BHP. But just in case there are a few who don't, it certainly qualifies, in my opinion, as the most recent catastrophic failure of the mining industry. Because, and why do I say the mining industry? Because, it goes beyond any one company. But in this particular instance, Valle had constructed a tailings dam many years ago, decades ago, directly above a village, which in ordinary circumstances, someone might have questioned that particular placement. No doubt convenient for mine planning, but not as convenient for the residents of the village. And I'm going to come back to that point about social interaction. And so the dam had, according to press reports, the dam had been showing signs of potential imminent failure. There was some leakage. It had been inspected several times. There are allegations that corruption was involved in not reporting these potential signs of failure and not acting on them, which of course is the fault of the Brazilian authorities. So there's a lot of guilt to go around on this incident. But eventually what happened is the dam failed, causing a catastrophic landslide, which essentially buried the village. And some of the victims are likely never going to be found. So that's one part of the bad story. The second part of the bad story is that, again, now this is a problem that affects the industry. There's frequently a breakdown in communication between the elements at a mine site engaged with the local community and the mine manager or other senior officers who are involved in mine operations. So what I mean by that is possibly someone in the social side of Valle had been in contact with villagers and heard concerns. And if those concerns were relayed, either they didn't reach the right people or they did, but they also were ignored. So there's an issue about how well the so-called hard and soft sides of the industry coordinate among themselves, particularly at the ground level. So that's the failure part. But the industry as a whole moved urgently to address the underlying problem of how do we as an industry want to deal with our tailings going forward. Because inevitably, mine operations will continue to generate tailings. They're a byproduct of operations. They range the gamut from hard rock to soft rock. So it's a key element. And in a 2-year process, working together with the United Nations and with concerned social elements, including the Catholic Church, a new set of voluntary guidelines was developed by the International Council of Mining and Metals, which is ICMM. And this body, which is composed of the vast majority of international mining companies, does not have any legal authority to impose standards on any member company. However, it's generally recognized that if you are a participant company in the ICMM, you've had a voice in developing this policy, and therefore you are going to adhere to this policy going forward. And why that matters is it has ripple effect outwards to companies who are not actually in ICMM, because obviously when the majority of the industry introduces a new standard, other companies are going to be held to that standard as well. When communities, authorities, etc., look at either setting up a new mining operation or dealing with an existing one.
Now, Mel, wouldn't a lot of that have to do with ability to finance the operations? In other words, if you didn't adhere to the industry standards in compliance, safety compliance?
Absolutely, that can definitely affect the access to finance for a project. And more, the financial industry is scrutinizing projects for environmental and social aspects. That wasn't always the case in the past. And more as well, shareholders in companies also are demanding better and more extensive information about environmental and social measures.
Mel, tell me, as you know, Vale then, after this first catastrophic dam failure, had a second one. And they obviously, it was, I can't remember, maybe 3 years after the first one, they obviously were aware of the weaknesses, because you can look online and find a copy, or you can see the actual failure, because they had posted cameras around. They were concerned and were actually checking the dam on a regular basis. So what do you think in terms of sort of how many times does the mining industry get to kind of have these failures? Because as you say, the industry as a whole took some very specific steps to try to prevent it. So what happens now to somebody like Vale after 2 times having dam failures?
Well, let me clarify that the second dam failure also predated the development of the new policy.
Okay,
but again, it comes back to that sort of voluntary mechanism. The ICMM per se does not have any means by which it can enforce the standards. The enforcement is always going to be a problem for local authorities, which brings us back to the problem of corruption. Because, and you particularly, Cassie, with your background in law, you know this. Any country can have laws piled up to the ceiling, but if they're not enforcing them, they're 100% meaningless. And the same is true for the guidance developed by ICMM. If local authorities, due to corruption, simply decide to continue turning a blind eye, there is no means by which the company can be directly held accountable. I mean, obviously, post-disaster lawsuits, and there's a lot of litigation in Brazil that's going to continue for many, many years, probably decades. But that's pretty much the extent of it. Although, in some cases, I mean, obviously, a country always has the right to revoke a concession.
right.
So if a country were to decide, you know what, we've warned you, and you continue to flagrantly defy the law, so you know what, we don't want you in our country anymore.
That's right. Well, and I think one of the other positive, if you can say positive, aftermath of these 2 tragedies is, I suspect every mining company in the world took upon itself to go check their tailings dams. Because many of them were constructed in the same fashion as these 2 dams by Vale. And so there, it really impressed upon the industry that sort of we've had a warning. Now you have to go out and make sure your dams aren't in that same position. And I think it's caused a lot of remedial work that might not otherwise have taken place or wouldn't have taken place as quickly.
Oh, you're 100% right. You're 100% right, because the new policy that was developed by ICMM includes provisions related to essentially retrofitting your existing tailings and the kinds of technology that are available to assist companies with that.
Yeah, and Cassie, what I was going to ask too, aren't with most mine financing that it's not all cash on the barrelhead to start with, and so you're going to have periodic payments. And so wouldn't you have oversight along the way before there was another draw, for example, to see whether or not the standards are being adhered to?
Yeah, for sure. In a financing, the money comes out in tranches, and increasingly investors, banks, particularly people like the IFC, EBRD, they require oftentimes an independent engineer to be monitoring the progress of construction and these kind of activities. So there's no question that people would be, if you say you're building your mine to current international standards, there would be, the lenders would be expecting independent verification of that.
Yeah, good. Well, let's move on to Freeport in Indonesia. And Mel, you're probably more familiar with this than is Cassie, for example. You want to talk about that for a bit?
Yeah, it's such an interesting place, and in some ways an interesting example of again coming back to the importance, and obviously I'm biased, but the importance of environmental, social, and governmental activities, the ESG that's part of CSR, just to keep magnifying our alphabet soup.
Well, define ESG for us, though.
Environmental, social, and governmental relations affairs. Yeah, so, interestingly enough, Freeport literally, it was the then head of Freeport, Jim Bob Moffett, who discovered, so to speak, the Grasberg deposit. And this was in reading some old, basically travel logs from an explorer who had hiked up to the top of this extinct volcano and had written about all of these astonishingly beautiful green rocks that were lying around everywhere. And of course, to most people, that's just nice. Oh, okay, nice, have green rocks on top of a volcano. But Mr. Moffett read that and said, wonder if that could mighty chance be copper. And so went to investigate and discovered that indeed it's one, was then and is now one of the world's richest copper and gold combined deposits. And, it's very possible that no other company in the world at the time could have developed that mine. It's incredibly complex. There's even a video about Freeport building that mine. And just to get the trucks up to the top of this extinct volcano, you're 40 degree grades on the roads. It's incredible. And then having to get back down to the port that Freeport built. So, those are all tributes to Freeport. But, the mine was dogged by accusations of corruption because, Suharto was in power at the time in Indonesia. And anytime that you have a dictator in charge of a country, you have to deal with that person. There was a similar series of problems in the Congo too when Mobutu was in charge. But anyway, the mine was dogged by these accusations of corruption. And particularly as decades passed and a younger generation began entering politics, and they were opposed to Suharto. And by extension, they were opposed to Freeport because, again, if you do business with a dictator, then you're inherently evil from the perspective of many people around the world. And so while this was going on, Freeport's governmental contacts were not evolving. Their social contacts were not evolving because Mr. Moffett, who is very much representative of the old style, miners out there wildcatting and digging away with the shovel and so forth, felt very much that this important mine deserved his personal attention, and he gave it his personal attention, and he discouraged institutional attention from the mine people. So you didn't have experts developing relationships with these young upcoming politicians. You didn't have experts keeping in touch with the villagers and the social changes that were going on around the port and in the areas around the road where it comes down off the mountain. And so in some ways, Freeport was taken by surprise when about 5 years ago, the Indonesian legislature decided to introduce some changes to their mining law, which called upon foreign companies to turn over, being paid, but to turn over majority control of the mines to the Indonesian government. So that golden share, that 51%, by legal mandate belongs to the government of Indonesia. John and I discussed this, Cassie, a couple of years ago, and I'm certainly no lawyer, so I just coined a phrase that this is legalized nationalization.
Mhm.
And yes, you're paid for your mine, but that in itself was a lengthy negotiation because Freeport naturally brought in outside evaluators, auditors, experts to put a valuation on mine, which didn't happen to coincide with the valuation that the Indonesian government had placed on the mine. And in addition to that, at the same time, the Indonesian government had passed another series of changes to the mining law that essentially required more value add for Indonesia out of all their mining operations. I mean, this was not aimed specifically at Freeport. It's an across-the-board change that affected all of the mining companies from coal and iron ore to copper and gold. But, companies were told that they must build smelters, for instance. Freeport was told, you must build a smelter. And again, we brought in outside international experts to make the point that there's not enough capacity to run a smelter. Our output alone does not justify a smelter, and we are the largest mine. And even when you throw in everybody else's production, it won't keep a smelter running. But the Indonesian government didn't happen to agree with that. Their concern obviously is more around creating local jobs, increasing taxation capture, etc. And so they basically shook their heads and said, listen, if you don't want to build the smelter, you don't need to export. And that was the third change that the Indonesian government had introduced, and again, that affected the industry in all of its aspects, was the ability to simply say, you, company X, we're freezing your exports. Go ahead and stockpile them. Do whatever you like with them, but you're not going to get them out of our ports until you do what you're told.
Yeah, and Mel, what is in retrospect, is there something that could have been done as you're going along to potentially change an outcome such as this?
In my opinion, it is always important to keep strong governmental relations. You can never be on just one person's side. You can never be on just one party's side. It's essential to truly be nonpartisan and to be very, very actively engaged. Using the knowledge of your local employees, using the knowledge of the political contacts that you have already, using the knowledge of the U.S. Embassy, which is a key resource in identifying young political leaders, to inform your outreach. And that allows you to do a couple of things. It allows you to combat the impression that you're all inherently corrupt villains who are here to exploit us and you don't like us and you don't care about us.
Yeah.
And it also allows you to be able to track those kinds of thoughts before they become law. Because this obviously was discussed for quite some time in the inside circles of the Indonesian government. And the mining industry as a whole, not just Freeport, did not seem to have those kind of strong governmental relations that would have alerted them in a much more timely fashion that this is coming down the road and it's about to run over you. and given perhaps an opportunity to contribute to the formation of that law. You wouldn't turn it aside entirely. Once people begin thinking in certain ways, you're not going to derail it entirely. The question is, what can you do to mitigate the damage?
Yeah.
And if you have those strong relationships, if you have what I call friendships, where you've had people to your home for dinner, you know about their families, you have that human connection, you at least will be heard.
Sure. Okay. Well,
Oh, I'm sorry, John. I was going to say, you know as well the impact of corruption in particular in Indonesia, and how even though the political scene changed from Suharto to sort of a new group of leaders, and I totally agree with you, I think the mining industry got caught out across Indonesia by not understanding that the old way they engaged with the government was sort of out, and you needed to know a whole new sort of cadre of people that had influence. And now what you've seen too, I think in the interim too, is a rise of local Indonesian miners, people that believe they know how to run large mining operations. And I think looked at sort of the prize of Indonesia, and it was coupled with this growing nationalistic view in Indonesia that these kind of assets should be owned by Indonesia or Indonesians. And as you say, those kind of confluence of a change in political influences, corruption, and a mining industry that got caught out because they thought actually things were going well, really contributed to all of that, I think, too.
Yeah, I want to follow up on that, because the corruption thing is really important, because I think that, and this is true not just of the mining industry, but even, for instance, in the diplomatic arena. I think that so often when there's been a history of corruption in a place, and that country really takes rigorous and effective steps to combat it, that's still not regarded as true. And there's still the impression among industry, and even, as I say, among the diplomatic service, that yeah, a lot of lip service, talk, but this isn't real. They still expect the suitcase under the table. And that can also contribute to situations like Indonesia, where entire industries are blindsided by complacency. That yeah, we know how it's done here. They can say what they like, but we know what they want. And that kind of a cynical, disconnected attitude can really lead to problems. But I also want to touch on the skills aspect of things, because we're seeing, I mean, all the countries watch each other. All the mining countries watch each other.
Right.
So, Chile sees what happens in Indonesia, Peru sees what happens in Indonesia, Congo sees what happens in Indonesia, and everybody wants to do their version of it. And the aspects of law that changed was to require senior positions to be handed over to Indonesians. So, you couldn't have an expat mine manager any longer. You had to have an Indonesian, which raised concerns, red flags around the question of corruption, and also the question of culture. Because sometimes you start out as a person, but because your culture places so many demands upon you, you become corrupt. So if you're the only person who has a well-paying job, and your extended family total is 56 people, and there's kids that need school fees, and there's sick parent need hospital fees, and there are wedding fees to be paid, and funeral fees to be paid, and fees, everybody shows up at your door. Yeah. And you have a cultural obligation to share the benefit of your position. And therefore, a company like Freeport can have considerable concern about being mandated that, you must put an Indonesian in charge. And for us, the situation was also complicated by local tribal concerns. Yeah, so just to finish the Indonesian idea, the problem that was that was and is particular to Freeport is the location we have in Papua New Guinea, in Papua. So Indonesians as a whole regard Papuans as virtually a subhuman group, and definitely much too stupid and inept to be trusted with mine matters. And so Freeport wound up caught in the middle between irate Papuans who quite naturally felt that if people were going to get senior positions, they should be in line for them, and the Indonesian government, who essentially said, oh, we're not turning our mine over to a bunch of Papuan savages. And so, you know, coming to Peru, it's similar in many ways because, you know, we wound up, Freeport being the we in this instance, we wound up in a situation where, in this instance, not for our fault, we had a lot of irate local people, and they were blocking the one and only road access to the port. We had incidents, shooting incidents. We had incidents where our employees were accosted and in some cases attacked by angry locals who felt that they were not being treated equitably and not getting, quote, their fair share. And the same sort of scenario has affected Peru as well. And what happened there is you have a good example, a good coming together, the power of social media and the clash of when, again, you underestimate who you're dealing with. You know, if the company, in this case, Southern Copper, if the company assumes that it's dealing with a bunch of backwoods, primitive, indigenous hicks in Peru, and therefore they can complain as much as they like, and it can even block the road from time to time, but we'll get the local authorities to chase them off for us. If that's your approach, you have gravely underestimated your opponent, because particularly in Peru, what superficially appeared to be poorly informed indigenous peoples turned out, possibly with some outside guidance, to be really pretty astute on social media and tweeting out about, oh, the copious amounts of dust and the illnesses that those were allegedly causing among the children, and the copious amounts of ore being hauled out on heavy trucks at high speeds through the villages, further endangering children, women going to market, etc. The tweets, the Facebook posts were out there, and the company didn't even seem to know it. Until suddenly they wound up in a situation where the roads are blocked and the local authorities are not stepping in to chase the indigenous people away. In fact, the local authorities are questioning the company. Well, but what about this allegation? What about that allegation? What about this? They said this. Can you prove to us that what they're saying isn't true? Suddenly the local authorities were not automatically on the side of the company because of the degree of international attention that the indigenous people had managed to attract and not be brushed under the carpet any longer. And so literally, Southern Copper was forced at one point into a force majeure declaration because they couldn't get the copper out of the country. This obviously was before COVID. Nobody can get the copper out right now, but this was another situation.
Yeah, Cassie, why don't we move on to some of your experiences? Do you have any things that really pop out as being some of the really good examples of both failures as well as successes?
Sure. You know, I'll talk about a couple of failures and then talk about one I think is a real success. And a lot of these failures have a lot of the same elements that Mel talked about. The first one I want to talk about is Lydian International, which is a junior mining company was listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange and headquartered actually here in Denver. They have been constructing the Anusar gold project in Armenia. And that was meant to be a large-scale low-cost operation producing 225,000 ounces a year over an initial mine life of 10 years. The mine was expected to produce hundreds of jobs for the local people in Armenia and millions of dollars of revenue for the government. So construction started in 2016, and at that time they had met all legal and environmental requirements, and the mine was, or the construction was fully financed. And then the problem started. So since June of 2018, both local people and environmental activists have blockaded the road that stopped essentially all construction when the mine was about 75% constructed. And that blockade eventually resulted in 90% of the workforce being terminated, all of the supply arrangements, including local supply arrangements, being terminated. Eventually, the company defaulted on its loan obligations, so it is currently, it sought creditor protection in Canada and is in a restructuring process. Excuse me, and in February of this year, the company was required to delist from the Toronto Stock Exchange because it no longer met the requirements. So you look and you say, what happened to a mine that appeared to have a lot of community support, had government support, and was bringing and meeting the most current international standards, particularly in terms of social interaction and environmental? Well, you know, what happened was sort of a confluence of events, some of which the company could control and some of which they couldn't, but it produced a perfect storm for the company. So in May of 2018, there was a velvet revolution in Armenia and a new government came in. And the opposition candidate that was elected as prime minister came in really as a result of civil society acting and social protests. So that's what brought him to power. And as a result, he was very reluctant to use police power, his police powers, to dispense the protesters of the blockade at the mine, even though the government acknowledged that those protesters and that blockade was illegal. In addition, the mine attracted, like lots of mining operations, Mel, you know this, a lot of global anti-mining sentiment, particularly anti-mining interests from Europe. And then finally, local mining companies were unhappy that this Canadian company was bringing international environmental and other standards to the country, because obviously they were operating at a much lower level. And the problem in Armenia is it's got this long, sordid environmental legacy left over from the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union left, they left a big mess for Armenia, and its people have felt that. So as a result of this legacy, there's quite a bit of suspicion about mining, and particularly about mining's impacts on water. So the final thing in this storm of events was there was a lot of local support from the community, but on two occasions, the local water supply to the local community was disrupted by the mine. It wasn't material, it didn't pollute the mining source. The problem was fixed within a couple of days. But after the second time, the first time they kind of got over it. After the second time, of course, suspicion started to grow in the community. And so now you've got this confluence of a community that's not quite so sure they support the mine. They're a little worried about its impact. A government that doesn't know very much about mining is beholden to civil society. Now they're not sure the local community supports it, and these outside influences. And so what you see, and I think the lesson of Lydian, because it was a great project, I'd seen it, that despite bringing the highest international standards and having the support of the IFC and the EBRD, the mines stumble with respect to the local community's water source really created a lot of vulnerability. And so then, and those were events that the mine could control. These other events they couldn't control, they have to manage or they have to work with. But once a mine doesn't do what they say they're going to do, either from an environmental point of view or a community human rights point of view, then that makes the company vulnerable. And at the end of the day, probably doesn't matter how good your mining deposit is or your mineral deposit. So ultimately, where we are is the mines, shut, or construction shut down, the mines in reorganization. The owners are trying to sell them.
Cassie, I have a question. Do you happen to know what the mine response was after the water incidents in terms of what they did with the community?
Yeah,
Anything?
well, as I understand, they responded very quickly, and they realized that they needed to do more outreach and provide more information. They had an independent group come in and do a survey of sort of what the local community thought of mining, of this mine. And what they found was that the community actually didn't really know very much about this project and what it was really going to do and how it was going to be managed. So they, I think, definitely stepped up their efforts in that regard. But it was at a time when these other influences were then coming in, and it just made it, then all of a sudden this company who's headquartered in Denver has to manage a number of things. Politics in Armenia, international government outreach, local competitors that are, and so the problem becomes not just what did they do when they broke the water pipes to the community, it's this much bigger. And that's, I think, ultimately what makes companies vulnerable. And it doesn't matter if you're Freeport or you're a junior company.
And Cassie, do you think that it would make a big difference to bring local engineers and managers into the company so that the focal point of some of these explanations of what's going on and how they're going to be fixed, if that's coming from a local person as opposed to a so-called expert?
Well, you know, John, I absolutely agree. But in this case, the company, actually the highest official for the company was Armenian. They had quite a big Armenian staff. They had a big environmental Armenian staff. I think what they didn't have, and it kind of goes to Mel, your sort of skill set, which is what happened is the government changed. You know, in Armenia, the politics ever since they became an independent country had been about the same. So the company had continued to engage from a governmental perspective in the same way. And they as everyone was, were surprised when, you know, this Velvet Revolution comes out, and then you suddenly have an opposition figure who, and this is, I think, a fair criticism, for years he and his party had been in the opposition. So all they had been doing was saying, this doesn't work, you can't do this, you're corrupt. When they suddenly had to run a government, they didn't necessarily have those skills, and they had to put that government together. And particularly, they didn't have expertise in understanding what this mining operation could do for the local economy.
Yeah, so this really goes back to Mel's point on trying to gauge all elements of local politics.
Yeah, absolutely. And not assume that what you know today is what you're going to know tomorrow or next week.
Sure.
You know, the other example, and I think this one's very similar, is if you look at Barrick's mine in, excuse me, Tanzania, the North Mara mine. It's in northern Tanzania, 20 miles from the Kenyan border. It was acquired by Barrick in 2006 when Barrick acquired Placer Dome. It had been a Placer Dome operation. It's a combined open pit and underground mine that produces about 240,000 ounces a year. But in the 2 decades that this mine has been both in construction and in operation, it has seen nothing but extreme violence, lots of human rights allegations, lots of environmental problems. The local police that has an MOU with the company to provide security, the local police and the security forces have been accused of killing anywhere from tens to hundreds of people and raping countless women. So this has resulted in multiple human rights claims against the company, multiple lawsuits. The president took this on as a cause, accused Barrick of tax fraud. It ended up stopping the export of all their concentrates at not only North Mara, but all their mines. And so had quite a big impact. And eventually Barrick had to enter into a $300 million settlement with the government to settle a lot of these claims that were generated from North Mara, as well as has had to undertake to improve its tailing management system. Now, if you look back, kind of how did this happen? The mine started in the 1990s, and at that time, after they had obviously developed a positive feasibility, the local community was not relocated. So there's approximately 70,000 people that live very close to the tailings dam, the waste rock dumps, and the processing plants. And I mean, when I say very close, you can stand on a waste rock dump and hear babies crying in the local community. The other thing that happened was locals were forbidden from doing artisanal mining anymore. And that was a very, very important source of money for the community. So as a consequence, ever since the mine started production, it has been plagued by intruders, both on its waste rock piles, as well as in the pit itself. I mean, they do their own prospecting. Oftentimes what's happened is there are rival gangs that go invade the pit at night. They have their own skirmishes. People have died as a result of those skirmishes, but then blame the company or the local police, and the guards that guard the operations have been subject to lots of bribery. They let some people in, they don't let other people in. So Barrick has acknowledged lots of these problems, obviously, in working out this settlement. But again, it kind of shows that whether you're a company like Lydian, a junior company, or a company like Barrick, a company like Freeport, these kind of social problems are very hard to fix once they start to create distrust in the community. The impacts of the North Mara mine, having that community so close, it's hard to imagine, but it's created an environment that's very difficult to get away from. Again, the loss of livelihood for those people, you take away their livelihoods, you can expect them on your operations.
Yeah, and I think that's a really a very good point there, Cassie, just because in so many of these areas, it's the artisanal mining that is how many people are making a living. And so when you don't recognize the fact that you need to provide some accommodation for the artisanal mining activities, you're just going to have constant problems.
Yeah, you end up with just constant conflict. You add in corruption with security forces or local police, and you have a problem. So,
Could I just add to that? Because in Congo, for instance, they passed a law to require, or to try to require, major international companies operating concessions to set aside areas in the concessions that would be for artisanal miners. And, at one level that sounds like, hey, this could be a great way to work through this issue. But again, the problem becomes international human rights organizations who say, oh, well, now see, you're complicit in endangering these child laborers because so many of the artisanals are children. And now the company has another reputational risk because now you're facilitating illegal child labor and you're perpetuating a vicious cycle of poverty and endangerment.
Exactly, and if in so many of those instances, they also don't use any sort of environmental modern science. And so they're creating environmental problems. You only need to, well, look at what Newmont faced in Indonesia in the 90s. They got blamed for a lot of environmental problems, mercury in the water that was being created by the artisanal miners. And so I think for companies to not really try to think creatively and understand that they're going to have to grapple with artisanal mining, and it occurs everywhere, in Latin America, in Africa, everywhere. They're, as you say, they're fooling themselves, because that will come back in a million different ways to haunt them.
Yeah. Okay. Why don't we move on to some of the good examples coming out of the Dominican Republic?
Sure.
You want to talk about that?
Yeah, I will. So, you know, in 1999, the Dominican Republic had what was one of the world's largest known gold deposits, and it had been abandoned. It had been abandoned by the state-owned mining company in the Dominican, and they had left just this legacy of pollution from having not had a very successful mining operation. They had car-sized boulders that leached heavy metals into what the locals would call the blood river, because the river ran so red from its contaminants. And that river drained into the largest reservoir in the country. At that time, reclamation was estimated to cost $50 million. So, and I think, John, you maybe have a picture of.
Yes, we have an image of the before picture, and we'll put that up.
Okay, well, and so the mine was acquired by Placer Dome in 2001, and then subsequently again, Barrick took over Placer in 2006. So now the mine is jointly owned between Barrick and actually Newmont. It was acquired by Goldcorp, 40% interest, but Goldcorp and Newmont are together now. In 2001, Placer signed a special lease agreement, and it was approved by the national government. But that also included a requirement to clean up the past environmental damage. Then Barrick took over. They delivered a feasibility study in 2008, signed subsequent amendments to the special lease agreement that adjusted fiscal obligations and gave the government more of a share of the pie. So now in 2020, what you have is one of the world's largest gold deposits, 25 million ounces being developed. It's got a 25-year projected mine life. It produces about 1 million ounces of gold a year. That will contribute about $11.6 billion to the Dominican economy during the course of its life, assuming a gold price of $1,600, which is below what the current price is. And production at the mine has contributed to 1.6% rise in the Dominican GDP in the first half of just 2013. It's got 2,000 direct employees and 10,000 additional indirect and administrative jobs. And what Barrick had to do was reclaim this awful historic environmental damage, which they've done. And so you look at that project, an operation that the government certainly didn't have the money to clean up, and lots of other companies wouldn't have come in and cleaned it up. And by cleaning it up and having a state-of-the-art mining operation, they've created incredible value for the people of the Dominican.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent example of being able to come in and really fix things up. Let's shift for a few moments to wrap things up on the tragedy that happened in Australia with the destruction of some of the Aboriginal sites, archaeological sites. I think that we've all seen the news that that this tragic event happened, and I think that we're looking at what needs to be done, both looking at the pressures within the mining industry, as well as the pressures that are put on the local managers to respond to mine management. either one of you want to kick into that one?
Well, I'll just pick up from your last point, because even the press reports seem to make clear that, you know, the mine manager was informed of the nature of the area. The social community people had conveyed the information that this is thousands of year old sacred site, protected area, et cetera, et cetera. And so to have that information in hand, you know, you say to yourself, then why in God's name did they blow it up? And the answer is because a lot of times that mine manager is caught in the middle between the information that he has from someone who works for him and the demands that he has from his bosses for upping the production, developing a resource, and getting it out to market so that the shareholders get the return that they expect on their investment. And I think that this unfortunately is a classic example of that.
Well, and I think, you know, what is so interesting is that Rio, the company that did this, is a company that was one of the very early adopters of the importance of CSR and ESG, and brought professionals in to manage that as part of their entire business operation. And so I think it sort of shows exactly what Mel said, not only pressure, and how despite a company's best policy or intentions, that can easily, those kind of things get easily lost when somebody is saying, but how many ounces are you going to produce this week or this month? And you have to have systems in place that don't let that happen.
You know, and when you talk about systems, Cassie, I mean, it's interesting how pervasively within the industry there's that sharp divide between so-called soft and so-called hard functions. And the perception is that the hard functions are the revenue generators, and the soft functions just eat revenue and contribute nothing in return. And there's also a misplaced sense that, oh yeah, anybody can do what they do, for heaven's sakes. It's not as if they're engineers. They just go around and talk to people. Anybody can do that. Well, guess what? If anybody could do that, then they would have been doing it.
Right.
And I think that the best solution to that, and I've argued for this before, is that you have to have your ESG voice in the room, in the C-suite. From the day that you first look at a country from your exploration side and you start talking about building a mine, right through to the mine closure process, you have to have that voice at senior levels in a position to say, no, hard stop. And that is the industry. I mean, obviously there can be exceptions, but as far as the industry goes, that structure is not in place. And that value perception is not in place. And the truth is, when do you see the value from the community and social and governmental relations people? You see it when things fail. You see it when a government shuts down your exports and you start losing, you know, tens of millions of dollars a day, or when your tailings dam fails and you've lost billions of dollars. Suddenly you can quantify the value of your ESG people.
Yeah.
Right.
But again,
Well,
the industry doesn't see it that way.
And I think you're exactly right. They don't not only see it that way, but if you look at, again, these failures and anything that has really gotten in the way of big mining projects, since I've been practicing in this area, it's been these issues. It's been these soft issues that have stopped development or have barricaded projects or have resulted in reputational damage or monetary harm. And so it's not so much the engineering, you know, there have been engineering failures, but those are ones engineers like to fix. It's these other ones that take a skill set that I would say, and I agree with you, it's not always valued, but it's become very professionalized in the last 20 years. There are degrees, advanced degrees you get in this. And the idea that people just send out the mine manager's secretary to talk to the community is a really outdated one. Because as you say, when they shut the mine down and you can't get billions of dollars of concentrate out, that's when you realize how valuable those people are.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point, and really a good point or a good time to finish up here. Cassie and Mel, thank you very much for your insight to this issue, and perhaps some of your suggestions will be taken up, and we can run with them. So, thank you very much, and
Thank you.
we should have some time for questions and comments either after this presentation or at the end of the day. So thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, John. It was a pleasure.
It was great.
Okay, thank you very much. We're back on the air here, and we do have both Cassie and there's Mel. She's here too, and we have a number of questions. And actually, Christy has had some experience with the mine in the Dominican Republic, and so maybe she has some comments related to that. But let's go to the questions. The first one came from Dune Strickland regarding the voluntary standards on tailings dam construction. When you were talking about that, Mel, I think that you talked about these standards. Are these addressing only new mine construction and not addressing some of the problems with existing mines?
No, the standards also include suggestions for ways in which existing tailings areas can be strengthened and improved. So it takes account of the existing stockpiles. I mean, obviously you can't just up and relocate your tailings facilities, but yes, there are provisions for how to make them stronger and safer.
Good. Yes, and I know that that on some of our past summits, we've had some professional work that was being done by a graduate of the University of Arizona's Department of Mining and Geological Engineering on remote testing of the or remote monitoring of some of the water escaping from the dam. So one of the other questions we have here, let's see, in terms of Vale, BHP, and Freeport, you have amongst the largest mining companies in the world with vast financial and technical resources. The projects that they were dealing with are of a scale to be nationally significant, but they directly affect a very local community. In these cases, is it warranted for the miner to fund local communities such as they are given a clear voice in expressing how the projects affect them? If so, when the community says no to development, what does the miner do? And this comes from Ernie Lalonde in Toronto.
Okay, well, I mean, I've never worked for BHP, so I won't presume to speak for them, but Freeport does have a very inclusive dialogue with local communities. For example, in both Indonesia and the Congo, we set up a jointly managed foundation into which Freeport contributed a percentage of our revenue for the local community to manage for itself and decide on its own priorities. And that organization also served as a consultative body to the mining operation, especially when we were working on things like relocating villages. So once we're operational, at least again in Freeport's case, once we're operational, we established mechanisms for that. During the construction phase, the coordination took place on a more diverse basis where, folks from our social division would visit the individual villages to establish the relationships, to get to know the tribal chiefs, to get to know the village elders, to explain to them what division is, etc. So, I mean, there's sort of two parts to this question. There's the part about what do companies do when they're operating. So that's my answer in terms of that aspect. The part about sort of consultation and what if communities say no, that's more around the area that is called prior informed consent. And that precedes the establishment of the actual mine. And usually, the government is the facilitating agent for discussions around prior informed consent. So the mining companies are a party to that conversation, but the government is the convening agent.
Yeah, and I guess I would just add that I think increasingly companies realize the importance of capacity building within communities. And as Mel said, not only so that you have this dialogue, but that you're increasing the community's ability to communicate not just with the company, but also with the government, and to communicate their concerns in a different way. And so I think mining companies that are looking at kind of best practices work to come up with ways to actually build that capacity.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Cassie, because I forgot to add that we have representatives as part of the foundation group. So we're bringing that aspect in.
Thank you. And Brian, could you make Christy a co-host here so that she can unmute and appear so she can ask some questions too? Another question from Ernest Lalonde. You've spoken about several international cases. How do these issues relate to mine development in the United States, particularly with reference to indigenous populations across the country?
I'll just say, and Mel jump in, but I think everything we've said about community engagement and community governance, environmental, social governance within a company, same thing applies. And if anything, applies even more in the United States, because in most cases, the institutional enforcement of a lot of this has been institutionalized in terms of laws, in terms of what you have to do, in terms of procedures on public lands. And so if anything, I think companies take some of the practices they learn in engaging, particularly with indigenous people in the US, and try to take those best practices when they go outside of the US or Canada. Because I think there's a lot of engagement in, particularly in Canada right now with First Nations and the US, around how do we engage with these communities.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the US government agencies that are involved in permitting processes, ranging from the Bureau of the Interior to, which would encompass Native American issues as well as public lands, to in some cases, forestry and energy, etc. Each one of those has a mandate for public consultation and input. So before they can finalize their part of the permitting process, they're required to do public consultations. And particularly here in the US, there's many examples, including one right here in Arizona, of companies who have been in the permitting process for more than a decade, in order to have sufficient time for public input to be reckoned with.
We have an excellent question here from Holland Shepherd. It says, where mining laws and regulations do not exist or are very weak, how do large corporations address socio-environmental impact, and how is it enforced? How important is it for a large mining corporation to be working with a foreign government that actually has viable mining laws and regulations?
Oh, what a joy to work with a professional government that has clear, transparent laws that actually have been based on knowledge of the industry as well as knowledge of their country. Oh, what a joy. Doesn't happen all that often, though, in all fairness. I will say that particularly on the African continent, the United Nations has played a big role in trying to improve the inclusiveness and the quality of mining laws and mining codes. That was certainly the case in the Congo, where in 2003, the country's mining code essentially had been written by the United Nations, pretty much in its entirety. It has subsequently been revised by the Congolese government itself, not always in ways that are encouraging to investment. So it's infinitely better from a mining company's perspective to have an educated, engaged, competent government authority to work with as a partner in developing. And the first part of the question, in terms of sort of who enforces these things, it's kind of what Cassie was saying earlier, that, you know, reputable mining companies, whether they're the ICMM or not, are pretty much self-policing, because we're very aware of social media. We're very aware of scrutiny. We're very aware that there's not virtually, with the exception possibly of North Korea, virtually not a country in the world where there are not international bodies present, embassies, the United Nations, the World Bank, etc., who can request to visit the mine, or who certainly can talk to the people who live on the concession and find out what's going on. So it's simply not in a mining company's interest, in almost without exception, as long as we're talking reputable companies, to not keep on top of managing the environmental aspects.
Yeah, thank you. I think that we have another question, follow-up question from Ernest Lalonde that maybe cuts to the chase on it. In a large mining company, is the environmental stewardship function best as a part of the control and audit function, or a part of operations responsibility?
You know, that's a really interesting question. I would argue that it's part of both, because you really need the audit function ensuring that what the operations say they're doing is in fact what they're doing. And you know, that concept, you know, most mining companies are public companies. They have to report. And what they want to do is be able to report on their systems and controls and how they ensure that they're meeting international best practice. One of the ways you do that is being able to demonstrate you are in fact auditing it. You're not just relying on what the operations people are telling you. You've got that independent function. So I think Ernest raised a really good point. You kind of have to have both of that. I think the other enforcer of these laws are the, you know, the rest of the banking and finance community, the investment community, shareholders. There are a lot of those forces that a mining company might be the biggest mining company in the world, but what they don't want is their headlines saying they've just destroyed you know,
An indigenous ceremonial site.
Yes, exactly, that are thousands of years old. And because that creates huge problems for the company in a number of ways, not only legal liability, but reputational liability that passes on down. So there's a number of sort of pressure on the company that is more than just the law. And so again, the company wants to be able to say, here's how we can demonstrate that we're meeting international best practices.
Sure, thank you. Christy, I think that, did you have some comments you might want to make about the issues in the Dominican Republic?
Sure. My experience with Pueblo Viejo dates back to 2014, but we have an expert as well from the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals, Metals, and Sustainable Development, Aaron Cosby, who will be joining us on the last panel discussion. But one function of the Intergovernmental Forum is for members of the forum, they can request to undergo an assessment of how their national laws and implementation of their legal framework aligns with the IGF's mining policy framework, which is a broad set of good practice standards. So one of the site visits we made that is written up in the IGF assessment report for the Dominican Republic is on Pueblo Viejo and looking at the range of successes and failures around the history of the mine when it was originally operated as Rosario Dominicana, and then reopening the mine and the cleanup involved in that, and an innovative project to reprocess the high-grade tailings and the funds that came from that processing from an Australian-based company called Pantera Gold, previously known as Enviro Gold. But one of the lessons that I really took away from the site visit as a whole that's written up in the IGF report is around how stakeholders were working through multi-stakeholder organizations to use funds from the mine for current and future sustainable development projects. So there's a really good example of in Sanchez Ramirez, which is the province where the mine is located, where the community got some support from the World Bank to really do a very thorough assessment of the concerns of a broad cross-section of the community, and how, as they started to get a really sizable influx of funds from the mine, that they would use it not just for current generations, but future generations as well. And the way that they determined together what the community's objectives were took a long time, but came to more favorable outcomes than possibly other jurisdictions that didn't take that type of approach and maybe didn't use their funds in as much of a thoughtful way. We've certainly seen as SDSG a really wide range of approaches to using revenue sharing funds, ranging from a municipal leader deciding to design a casino that doesn't benefit the broader community to this more engaging long-term model that has continuous mechanisms to really make sure funds are used in a way that's reflective of broader community interests, and certainly may be very different objectives than the mining company or the government would come up with on their own. Yeah. But yeah, I can also share a link to that report, but appreciated the examples that come from that.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you, Christy. And I think that really brings us to our last topic for the day that I think is really a fantastic one. So for Cassie and Mel, thank you very much for your participation here. And hopefully if you have time to come back on and we can have any additional questions if we have it at the end of the day. So thank you very much.